Hello and welcome. This is the Nutritionist webinar. For those of you who are keeping track and those of you who may have lost track, today is Thursday, May 14th, and it is still the year 2020. I'm Marianne Fessenden from AMTS. We have a great talk with Dr. Bill Stone coming up. I have a few details to take care of first. We have pre-recorded the presentation for convenience of the presenter. We will take live questions, which he will answer at the end of the webinar. These educational webinars are multinational. I am pleased to welcome several co-hosts during the question sessions. If you are catching the afternoon session, I am always joined by Paula Torillo from Argentina. You may also hear questions from Elena Bonfante in Italy, Sean Lee for China, Vadim Bekchebnikov in Russia, and Marcelo Ramos in Brazil. We welcome their questions, and it gives an opportunity for consideration of viewpoints of concerns in different farming systems around the world. Depending on how you're listening, you can submit queries through me or one of my attending co-hosts. We will read them and ask the presenter for you. Later, a complete recording of the archived webinars, as well as the question and answer sessions for each, will be available on the AMTS website. For those of you who would listen to the webinars whilst driving, if you are still driving, we have converted the videos to MP3 files that can be downloaded for offline listening. Those podcasts can be found at the Ag Model System website under the Webinars tab or Resources tab. Today we're joined by Dr. Bill Stone, who serves as the Director of Ruminant Technical Services for Diamond V. He received his DVM at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and his PhD in Applied Dairy Nutrition from Cornell University. His primary areas of interest are dairy cattle nutrition and feeding management, forage management, and the identification of bottlenecks in dairies. It's great to have Bill join us today. His topic is minimizing variation between formulated and consumed rations, a key to enhanced herd performance. I listened to the webinar as we were recording last week. I think you're going to find this a valuable one. Please now enjoy Dr. Stone's presentation. Remember to jot down any questions you have during the presentation and type them in the Q&A or chat windows. We'll have an opportunity for him to answer those questions after the presentation.
Hi everyone, thanks a lot for joining me today, and I get to share with you some really interesting information. Today we're going to look at ways to minimize variation between formulated and consumed rations, and this is really important because it's truly a key to enhance herd performance. There's a lot of different areas that can be evaluated and that influence this whole area of consistency in the TMR. And those areas include forage and feed analyses, making sure that they're accurate and truly reflect the feeds that are being fed. We always need to use accurate ingredient dry matters, and for many of our feeds, those dry matters actually change on a daily basis. Maybe not hugely, but they change some. And we need to have a system in place to make sure that we're using the correct dry matter. It's really important to prep forages before feeding. Get them all ready to go so that we're feeding this really good, consistent forage. And we'll be spending more time on that. We won't be spending much time on the areas in black. We're going to focus really on the areas in blue here. We need a feeder that's going to do a great job of accurately preparing a load of feed. Tmr audits are something Diamond V started many years ago to help ensure that the mixture wagon and that whole feeding process is consistent and is being used and is working properly. We'll spend quite a bit of time in that area. There are different techniques to minimize sorting. Of course, we want cows to eat that TMR that's been put together and not give them the option to eat whatever they may want. And finally, we need really good bunk management. We need to make sure that that feed is freely available to cows along the entire length of the bunk all throughout the day. So those are the big areas. Big areas in making sure that that formulated ration is the same one getting consumed by the cow. And now let's start digging in deeper. On every dairy, it's really important to have bunker management goals. And we got to make sure that our people working with the bunkers know what those goals are and that they're excited about accomplishing them. If there's any spoiled silage, we don't want our cows to eat it. So first we want to try to minimize it from occurring, and then if it does happen, we want to try to safely get it out of that bunker and not get into the cows. We want to have a vertical, smooth, tight silage face. We don't want one that's been loosened up, that air might infiltrate back into that silage, or if it's really uneven, it's that much more surface area for moisture to be collecting on as well. So a nice, tight, smooth, vertical silage face. We always want to remove enough silage to make sure that it's all good, fresh feed. We don't want any heating. And there's not a set recommendation for that. That amount of silage that needs to be removed will completely vary by the silo. It depends on how tightly it's packed, so what that silage density is. It depends on what that VFA profile is, and also probably what the natural level of molds and yeasts are in that silage. It can be as little as 1 to 2 inches, and it might be as much as 2 feet, depending on all those different factors. But once that silage is down, we want to mix it up good. We'll spend more time on this, but we want to make sure that we have a consistent silage, and that's why we would do some pre-mixing prior to feeding. Our goal is not to have any loose silage at the end of feeding. We don't want silage sitting there for potentially another 24 hours gathering moisture or just having that much more oxygen exposure and potentially starting some undesirable microbial growth. So no loose silage at the end of feeding. And finally, the leading edge of plastic on top of that bunker needs to be weighed down properly. It needs to be removed at least twice a week as a good thumb rule. This big bunker silo, we can see where they have defaced it. They've taken that defaced feed, they've pushed it up into this pile. They've done some pre-mixing of it, and they're trying to make sure that everything across this great big silo is all been mixed together and now is uniform. One little watch out, you can see they couldn't deface all the way to the bottom. And we certainly would not want, after this is used up, to have that feeder come along and scrape up this feed that they couldn't deface and use that to make a load of feed, because this part right here doesn't represent everything else throughout that silo. This is just an example of a really well bunkered, really well managed corn silage bunker. You can see this nice, tight, straight, vertical face. There was a little bit of spoilage here that's been removed. We've got tire to tire density all along that plastic, so we're not going to get air infiltration back there. So good job, dairy producers. Another silo here, this is just a safety watch out. I was by this bunker and we'd just been up close to it. We walked away and boom, down came this pile of corn silage right here. We always want to be really careful when we're by bunker silos. And ideally, we don't even have to go immediately up to that face. Ideally, we can look at forage that's been removed and is at a safe distance away from the bunker. If you must go up there, look very carefully. Don't go up underneath an overhang, for example. Don't go up here and stand and have a conversation. You go there for a short time period as possible and then exit the area. So always be careful around bunker silos. This is an excellent defacer. It's one that a lot of dairies in our area use. It's called a Forage defacer. Big rugged piece of equipment that will rapidly remove silage from a bunker. Another example, an Easy Rake defacer. It works particularly well with large corn silage bunkers, but it's essentially a heavy piece of equipment that, in combination with hydraulics, allows it to come right down through this silage and essentially rip that silage out. What's interesting, as long as your density has been good in packing, all these little ridges are still tightly packed. They're not loosened up in that removal process. That's another good piece of equipment, particularly, again, for corn silage. Well, the reason, again, I really mentioned doing that pre-mixing of forages is that there's variation throughout that bunker. This is a survey that we did in New York several years ago, where we went to a number of bunker silos and just basically dug a trench in that bunker with a backhoe. And we looked at silage removed from the upper third or middle third or lower third of the bunker. And we wanted to mimic what would happen if a feeder went up to that bunker with a loader bucket and got a whole loader bucket from one region of the silo as opposed to the entire face. And the bottom line is, just in dry matter variation, in corn silage, on the average, there's about a 10% variation in dry matter. For example, from 31% to 34% between regions in the bunker. In haylage, it's typically larger, about double that, at about 20% variation in dry matter. This can make for a big difference, and we'll touch back on that, but I'll do it right now. So just for example, if a TMR was supposed to be at 54.5% average forage level in that TMR, and if the feed are fed by regions, as opposed to across that entire face, then from one load to the next, that amount of forage could vary from 51 to 59%. And that's only looking at these dry matter changes. Of course, there's changes in fiber levels, in protein levels, VFA profiles as well. So that's why we always want to do this pre-mixing. So this area, again, excellent job. There was some spoilage here. It's probably because this is a little bit too steep of a drive over pile, and we probably didn't get as good of a packing on top of this pile as it should have. So you can see the spoilage there. It's been removed, but then it's been defaced, been pushed up into this pile, it's been mixed, and now we have a homogeneous pile of forage to feed, as opposed to a variable one if we fed by regions. Here is an example of that being done, where we have that forage, it's been defaced, and now it's being pushed up and pre-mixed there. Doing it again. Well, the next one. Okay. Another example of a gold standard, excellent plastic management. We see tire to tire contact, and we see these gravel-filled silage bags along the leading edge of the plastic. You can see silostop is being used here. That's only 5% is permeable to oxygen as standard plastic. So silostop covered by dual layer plastic on top of that, and then sealed so no air can migrate back underneath that plastic. Another excellent example here, tire to tire contact tied together, no opportunity for air to infiltrate back underneath that top cover. What happened here? Well, most likely it's some crazy animal that was after some other rodent underneath this plastic, but ripping big holes in this plastic. And of course, that's going to lead to lots of oxygen infiltration and spoilage then as well. What's interesting is that often this will be happening on a dairy, and no one in management knows that there's all of this rot on top of the bunker. And that's why I'm spending some time on this. We need to pay attention to this. Here's a massive pile of forage again, and we see what this looks like on top. These are someone's footprints here in this total rotted feed, and that's all being fed to the cows. That's going to lead to some ruminal indigestion, some loss of efficiencies that we don't want to have happen in our dairy. So we don't want this stuff going to our cows. Obviously not tire to tire contact along this entire edge of this plastic. So it's really easy for air to infiltrate back, and that will get this spoilage process going. Here's an example of what that will do. This is the temperature right underneath the plastic. So right at the edge of the plastic where it's been cut off, 65 degrees Fahrenheit. At the edge of the feed out face, where it's been exposed to oxygen now for a few days, it's 105 degrees. And with that, then of course, we start to have the growth of molds and other undesirable microbes that can upset that rumen flora in our cows so that it's not being as efficient or fermenting feedstuffs as efficiently as what we would like. Can also simply reduce dry matter intake too, and enhance spoilage of that TMR. So for all those reasons, we want to keep this stuff out of the feed. Here it is in the corn silage that was going to be fed to these cows. So that's top spoilage that was on top of the bunker, not removed. Now it's in the corn silage and it's going into that TMR. So this good, hardworking guy, he says, I don't want my cows to get that, so I'm going to go up there and I'm going to pitch it off. So it's a good job there. The only problem is this isn't really safe, is it? This fella unfortunately slips and falls. That's a long ways down. So our first approach is to try to, as much as possible, minimize this from ever happening. And then if it does happen, we need to put together a safe approach to remove that spoilage. At the very least, we would want to have a loader bucket right here with his colleague operating that right here so that he can't fall. So that would be the very first approach. The better one even would be to have an entire cable going over the top of that bunker and then have a restraint system that went from that worker to that cable so that that worker couldn't fall off and get hurt. Or even better, now I know not every bunker is like this, but this is a pretty neat setup where they simply cut plastic from one end to the other. They had enough room here now that they could grab that plastic with this big piece of equipment and then pull the whole thing back. So they've got a cable that's tied around here, pulling, sliding all this plastic and all the tires off. Now as it's sliding off, they can stack the tires up, and that would be a really neat way to do it. And of course, not all of our operations are set up to do that, but it's pretty interesting. Okay, we've got those forages all together and we're starting to prepare that load of feed. We want to have that whole loading system set up so that it's going to be easy for the feeder to do it, and also set up so that we're hopefully minimizing shrink as much as possible. This is a nice example of the feed truck parked in a recessed area so that the feeder has really good visibility of that entire loading operation here. This one is a little bit dusty, and obviously we're losing a lot of likely more expensive mineral-based components here off into the breeze. And it's why we want to try to have a few things here. If we can do some things for that mix that these minerals came in so that it's a bit wetter, it might be mineral oil, it might be part of a bigger mix with molasses or some tallow, but something to make it a bit wetter so we don't have as much dust. And the next one is, of course, always thinking about wind and how can we minimize wind where our loading is being done. So this dairy made a windbreak area here where here's their commodity shed, and they put this 90-degree angle loading area in so that they could load more undercover and again minimize particularly wind, but of course rain is minimized as well. Sometimes even with bins and downspouts, we'll have examples where feed will be discharging right from the upper part of the auger. And then as it's coming down into the mixer wagon, there's a great opportunity for blowing to occur. I've seen people use like this piece of drainage tile here, but it can sometimes catch on equipment and get ripped off. So this dairy made an interesting little setup. They've got, these are inner tubes, obviously. Inside here, there's PEX tubing. That's the like hot water tubing that would go in a concrete slab. It's bolted on either side of this discharge chute. There's a big clamp around this, and that PEX tubing holds this inner tube apart so that the feed can easily flow down and through it. This, of course, won't catch on anything, and it flexes if the tractor cab or the mixer wagon wall hits it. So I thought that was a neat example of farmer ingenuity. This is a dairy I got to visit in Japan. For anyone from Japan visiting, this is a really well-run dairy operation where I challenge you to look for the shrink. And basically, there essentially wasn't any. Here's all their grains in these upright bins, and the feeder pulls into this whole loading area, pulls a chain that opens up the chute door up here. Now the feed drops down through these, basically, again, these kind of sleeves, and into the mixer wagon. We've got windscreen material here on either side of this structure. And again, look at the complete lack of shrink. So a really nice, interesting loading system here. Well, if we think about our milking systems and our feeding systems, with our milking systems, we typically have a lot of systems in place to make sure that that milking operation is running properly. Because we know how important it is. We'll have milker training, and milkers are routinely trained on that milking routine so that it's done properly all the time. We'll have equipment that's evaluated on a regular basis, making sure that, for example, the vacuum level is right, the pulsators are working right, etc. And we do proper equipment maintenance. We might be changing liners every, 1,200 or 1,600 milkings. We make sure the water heater is working properly and the temperature is where it's supposed to be, that the vacuum regulator is working properly. We do all those things because we know how important that milking system is. But often with the feeding system, well, yep, the mixture wagon delivered feed today, we're good to go. Everything's operating properly. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. To help with that whole evaluation of the feeding system approach, over the last several years, Tmr worked to develop a Tmr audit system. And again, that's really designed to evaluate how that Tmr is being prepared and delivered. We want to make sure it's as consistent as possible from one end of the bunk to the other. So to do that, with this Tmr audit approach, what we do is have a load of feed that's been delivered here, for example, to this group of cows. And then we take 10 samples of feed from the first feed that was discharged from the mixer wagon down to the last feed that was discharged. And again, we're trying to sample this feed every 10% of the way that it was discharged here along the bunk. Of course, it's important to have this Tmr to be consistent from one end to the other because, first of all, we want it to reflect that ration that was formulated. But the other reason is that when cows come up and eat, they typically eat within a region all the time. Like, here's where these white cows live, right in this area. And they probably lie down over here and they eat primarily from this part of the bunk. And these cows over here primarily eat from this region of the bunk. So again, that's a real reason why we want it to be good and consistent from one end to the other. Well, on this dairy that we just looked at, this is with their pre-fresh cows. And just looking at this, you can see there's some challenges here. We got big clumps of hay here that aren't properly mixed in there. So now we got an example of if this cow doesn't want to eat that hay, well, she doesn't have to. Or if she only wants to eat more hay, well, she has that option. We don't want to give cows that option. This is what one of those screenings looked like from this pre-fresh ration. Now, here's those 10 samples that we collected from one end of the bunk to the other of this pre-fresh ration. Each of those samples were run through the Penn State particle separator. And this is the percent of particles on a weight basis here that were on the top screen or the middle or the pan. And we only use the 2 screen and the pan Penn State particle separator versus a 3 screen, primarily so that we have a sufficient amount of particles on each of the screens to have a good coefficient of variation. Okay, so there again, here we are from one end of the bunk to the other, those 10 samples, and here's the average. And let's just follow along, let's say the middle particles. And we obviously see, well, in all these particles, they're bouncing around a lot. We calculate a mean for the middle screen, it's 29.7%. And then we also calculate a coefficient of variation. And a coefficient of variation is essentially how much, on average, do these different measurements that we took along this bunk vary from the mean. Okay, so we're looking at how much variation there is from the mean along all these samples that were taken. Our goal is to have that CV be for the middle screen and the pan less than 2.5%. And for this dairy, you can see that we're generally pretty darn close to that. Let me explain this a little bit better. There's 4 loads of feed that were evaluated here. This is the amount of the Tmr on the top screen in each of those 4 loads and the CV associated with that. And here's the middle screen and here's the pan. We focus really on that middle screen and pan because often the top screen is such a small amount that the CV is always going to be larger. It takes very little variation if there's only 5.5% on something to have a relatively larger CV. So we focus more on this, again, this middle screen and the pan. Our goal is less than about 2.5%. You can see this dairy is doing pretty darn good. It could do a bit better. And we see where things are really bad. We're with that group that we looked at with the pre-fresh cows. So there's definitely some room for improvement there. Well, here's another example of a TMR. Again, one end of the bunk to the other. Those are almost completely straight lines. And that's saying that that particle size distribution from one end of the bunk to the other is the same. By the way, the particle size distribution, we've compared that to other measures of the TMR, for example, the protein levels or the mineral levels, and we found it to be very reflective. So it's a good proxy of how consistent that TMR is, and it's something we can do on the dairy that day, share with the dairy producers and the feeders, and make changes, hopefully to help correct any issues. So the load that we just looked at here, those nice straight lines, here are their CVs. Remember, we wanted to be less than that 2.5%, and boy, they sure as heck are doing it, aren't they? The highest is only 2.4%. So a really good, consistent TMR. This was in a twin screw vertical mixer wagon. Well, our goals, again, for the CV levels in these TMRs, ideally less than 2.5% for that middle screen in the pan. That's probably about the top 20 or 25% of TMRs. It's actually, we see it getting better. And we think it's getting better, very honestly, because we as an industry have focused more on this. So that's an example of TMR mixing basics are being done properly and the equipment is in good shape. We start moving up. So now our CVs are between 2.5% and 4%. That's probably the whole, upper maybe 50% of all TMRs. And if we improve that, we take that 4% down to 2.5%. Well, we can't say we always see an improvement on the dairy, an obvious improvement, but it makes sense always to try to make it be as consistent as we can. However, as things start to get basically more variable, so CV is above 4%, and now if we can bring that back down to where it should be, this is where we've seen more obvious improvements on the dairy, where it might be more milk, or it might be improved milk fat, or it might be a reduction in cases of indigestion, because again, that TMR that we want those cows to be consuming is being delivered. We got to make sure they're consuming it right. We got to make sure there's not sorting going on, but at least we're getting it delivered now. Here's another thing to keep in mind, some TMR mixing basics. Feed particles mix when falling together at the same time. Okay, so feed particles mix and they're falling together at the same time, and any ingredient or process that interferes with this will affect TMR consistency. Well, this is what you call a simple, and they have weighed out the different ingredients for this load of feed. They put them in this pile. Now they're coming in with this payloader and they're picking up the feed. They're going to pick it up, watch this, and they're going to dump it. They're going to do that 5 times, and we see these feed particles falling together at the same time. And again, he's going to do this again. And after this, this is going to be loaded into a wagon that is simply a transfer wagon with a system to bring the feed forward and then auger it out into the bunk. So there's some mixing when that is done as well, but I'm going to show you how well this works. It's really pretty interesting. Here it is right here, mixed with a payloader, turning it 5 times and then delivered with a delivery box. And obviously those are some super good consistent lines. So the point is not to get rid of your mixer wagon, but the point is feed particles mix when they're falling together at the same time. And we want to make sure that whatever mixing device that we're using, if it's a twin screw vertical mixer wagon, here's a horizontal auger wheel mixer wagon, that it's being used properly and is working properly. Well, our within Diamond V, we've identified these top 10 factors that cause TMR variation. And we're going to run through this list, but first, just to review them with you, we're going to discuss equipment wear and how important that is, mix time after the last ingredient's been added to the TMR, load size, the levelness of the mixer during loading and mixing primarily, I should say here, and mixing, the loading position in the mixer box, hair straw quality and processing, loading sequence, liquid distribution, the vertical mixer auger speed, and if hay restrictor plates are being used in vertical mixers. We're going to run through these a little bit. So equipment wear. First thing to think about is the maintenance program on your mixer wagon as rigorous as a program for your milking equipment. And you know what? I bet it's not. And if it isn't, get your book out. Get your mixer wagon book out and take a look at it. And what are you supposed to be doing for routine maintenance and keep on top of it. The primary wear points on different mixers with vertical mixers is the kicker plates, the augers, the mixer tub, and knives if they're needed and used. With horizontal auger mixers, it's typically the augers and the tub. And finally, with auger reels, it's the auger, the tub, and the reel. This is actually a picture from the first TMR audit I did. It's on about a 1,200 cow dairy. And this mixer wagon had delivered the load of feed. This is how much feed's left over in it. And if you look at it closer, these augers, they look pretty thin there along this auger. That should be really thick metal. That's thin, and that's a sign it's probably really worn quite a bit. And then this is called the leading edge of the auger. This is my old BlackBerry phone. It's about 3 inches wide. Well, there's supposed to be something called a kicker plate on this piece of equipment. It's a piece of metal that comes up and sticks up here, and it's supposed to be within 3/8 of an inch of the wall of this mixer wagon. Now, when this auger is turning, the kicker plate comes around and it acts like a plow, and it moves that feed away from the wall of the mixer wagon. Okay, so it's making a void here. As it's moving away from the wall, that allows the feed that the auger is rising up, bringing up to come down along the side. And it's these particles now that are moving, that are falling together at the same time, that will allow mixing to occur. Well, here's an example of kicker plates. And again, this is the old worn out one. It's supposed to be way out here close to this wall. It's worn way back here. This is when they replaced it, welded this new metal on here, and now it's close to the wall, so it's going to be functioning as it should be. Sometimes producers will try to slow down that wear and weld on hardened steel along the leading edge of the auger and along the kicker plate. So it's not a bad idea. But the watch out is, if you get a lip of metal here, that lip of metal will hold feed back, and that can impede that whole mixing process. So just be careful you don't have a big lip of metal from your hardened steel you put on there. That would be the caution. Okay, this is that mixer wagon we looked at where I had my phone in the wagon. And from the outside, boy, it looks pretty good, doesn't it? It's got pretty good paint. Looks like a good truck. That should be doing its job. Well, now we're going to watch that mixer wagon. Okay, we're going to take a look at it, mixing, and you think about it. Does that look like it's mixing properly? We see feed going around the circle here. You see a little movement back here, kind of going up and down, and then you see this mountain here. This feed not moving, that feed not moving. That's not mixing at all. So that's, again, a combination of these augers that have really worn and the missing kicker plates. And no one on this 1,200 cow dairy has any idea that this is how their equipment is operating. So here's one key point. Sometimes you can simply look at the mixer wagon, look at this load of feed that's being mixed like this, and you get an idea, is this system working properly or not? If you see this, you know it's not working properly. And now you have to, something we always do is look inside the mixer wagon when it's empty. And of course, that tractor is shut off and that feeder knows you're in there, and it's really nicer if they even have the key removed. Okay, so you're being very careful, but you're going to go in and you're going to look at all parts of that mixer wagon. And you're going to determine why isn't it mixing properly. Again, this is the reason why you're missing kicker plate and really worn augers. And this is what that TMR looked like from that load of feed. That's not very consistent, is it? We've got it bouncing all over the place. Just anyway, poorly mixed load of feed. Now, here's kind of the flip side. This is another vertical mixer wagon, twin auger, and I'm gonna have you watch this and look throughout this load of feed now. And what you're seeing is aggressive mixing, aggressive moving, complete lack of dead regions. There's kind of volcano coming up from those augers. Down below, that feed's being removed from the wall down at the bottom of the mixer wagon. That's allowing the feed from the upper part to be flowing down. So really good mixing action on this mixer wagon. And here's the concentrate particle separator shakeout from that load of feed. That's, I mean, we got a little inflection here on the very first sample, but everything else is just super. So what did that look like? Well, here's our comparison. Here's our first one that we looked at with a worn vertical mixer. And interestingly, here, this is the particle size average from the top, middle, and the bottom. 17.8 and 17.7, and they're fairly similar across these two completely different farms, different mixers, etc. But now here's the CV. 36% in the top screen, 11 and 6.2. Here's our mixture that's doing a super job, 4.6, 1.1, 1.2. That's just no comparison. And if you want to be a good dairy, you want to do a good job for your dairy clients, this is where you want to be. So you want to be figuring out if you're anything like over here, what's wrong? How can I get to where I'm supposed to be? Okay, next one, really simple one. Mix time after the last ingredient. And we need to have a timer there on the mixer wagon, or at the very least, the feeder needs to be using a timer on their phone or another set type of timer. And it's after the last ingredient's been added. It isn't, for example, if we're putting water in, we start the timer when we start to add water. It starts when the last of the water or the whey has been added to the mixer wagon. That's when the timer starts. The other one is, we don't mix for as long as it takes us to drive from the silos up to the barn, because speeds can vary, levelness will vary, distances will vary, and because of all that, times will vary. And the mixing ability of the mixer wagon will vary based on the levelness and speed of the augers, etc. So we want to be in that stationary spot, level spot, set mix time with a timer so we know it's done properly. The amount of time will vary. It's typically 3.5 to 5 minutes, but that will vary depending on what kind of shape that equipment is in, what that load size is, potentially ingredients, but usually 3.5 to 5 minutes. We'll do it. Okay, here's the same mixer wagon. Here's a load of feed that was mixed for 3.5 minutes versus 5 minutes. And we're going to come down here and look at our CVs. 18.5, 3.1, 4.8, 8.2, 2.1, 2.6, with that 1.5 minutes of additional mix time. So 1.5 minutes, even if they're making 10 loads a day, that's 15 more minutes for the feeder to spend mixing to get much better mix consistency. So obviously a great investment of time. Okay, load size. That can certainly make a difference in how well that mixer is operating. And here's this guy loading this load of feed. This was in Minnesota, and it's a cold day. And this guy doesn't want to be outside long, so he's heading for that cab. But anyway, that's a full mixer, and obviously we're losing some feed as well. Another example, too full of mixer. We actually see some feed coming out of that mixer wagon. It's like a really slow mix. Boy, that stuff on the top isn't really being incorporated with the feed down below there, is it? So you got to question how good of a mix that's going to be. And now we got this guy. This is kind of an amazing one. Let's see here. So obviously it looks a little full, doesn't it? And at least he's letting it mix more. He's trying to get it mixed. We know it's over full. There's only one problem. And the problem is the recipe calls for more hay. And so the feeder is going to do his best to do what he's supposed to do and get that right amount of hay in there. And look, he's going to be careful. He's going to work to try to get that weight just right. So he's trying to do his job right, he or she. Oh, a little bit more, a little bit more. Good, got it. Okay, so that's obviously a problem. Now, what happened here, most likely, that feeder didn't enter this ration into the feed management software. Someone else did. And either they had to increase the number of animals that they're feeding for, or they went from a more dense to a less dense ingredient. For example, haylage to dry hay. And they didn't think about, with that lower density ingredient, how much more space it would take. So it's an example of poor communication. That feeder, of course, has to communicate with whoever is controlling the size of the loads to make sure that the appropriate load size is being made, and that communication wasn't being done. But also, of course, the person entering it needs to be thinking of that as well. Well, here's an overloaded real auger mixer wagon. You see, first, it should be loading from this side where the auger is, but in addition to that, this feed is moving inside this reel. It's like it's in a drum. And the feed locked inside this drum, it's not going to fall and mix together at the same time. Only the feed in the very outer aspect over here is falling. Everything else is locked up inside that drum. And that's going to make for an inconsistent load of feed. As opposed to this one, now we see a lot of falling action. It's a wet, heavy TMR, but there's a lot of falling action going on there, and that's going to help to get that mixed properly. So here's same mixer wagon, overfilled or normal filled. What happened with our CVs here? We went from a 31.6, 7.4, and 5.2 down to 19.4, and then a 2.7 and 2.6. So really essentially met our goals there by making a bit smaller load size for that mixer. All right, another area, levelness of the mixer during loading. This is actually, it can be very important, and I'm gonna give you a great example of it. This one's obvious, right? Big slope there. That feed will be going to the back of the mixer wagon. How the heck can it move forward with that big slope in reverse like that? So that's an obvious unlevel area. This one, this is a Tmr audit I had done, and it's a Treely. The equipment was in really good shape. I thought this will mix fine. But you look at this, it's a little bit unlevel, and the mixer's been running, and since it's unlevel and sloping forward, the feed moves forward in the mixer wagon. Okay, so it's moving forward, obviously. It's hard for it, it's not moving backward. We're not getting proper mixing throughout that mixer. And also, they were putting haylage in later in the mix rather than early. And we see here some haylage clumps. And this is what the TMR looked like. This gal's posing for the camera here. But anyway, not a good, consistent TMR. They fed the same ration to 2 groups of first lactation animals, and that load wasn't as big as when that ration was delivered to 2 groups of mature cows. Okay, so this is to the first lactation heifer groups, and this is what it looked like. And you see some movement here, not real bad, but some inconsistencies there. It was a lot worse when that mixer wagon was totally full, and that's the picture we just saw with that feed moving forward. Now, let's look at the pan here. That's in green. We've got 40% of that TMR in the pan for the first 4 samples that were taken. The 5th one went up to 50%, and now they delivered all the feed to that first pen. They went to the second pen, and they got essentially 50%. The pan is all grain. So essentially this group was getting 50% grain. This group was on the same ration and 80% of their bunk was getting 40% grain. Okay. Now, what they did on the dairy, we changed the mix order so that the haylage went in earlier instead of later and turned the mixer on throughout loading. Didn't have a defacer here. And that's one more reason for the haylage clumps. But we're getting those haylage clumps broken up more throughout that loading process. And then they modified the hitch so that the hitch, so the mixer could be leveled. Okay, so they did some modification on the hitch. And this is what the TMR looked like after that. Here's this hitch modification so that this mixer wagon, again, now is going to be level. And this is what the TMR looked like now for that cow load of feed. Remember, we only had 40% grain here, then it bumped up to 50%. And now we see we're 46.6 down to 44.9, but that's pretty darn consistent there. When we looked at CVs now for these loads, so here's that, we saw that first lactation load that looked pretty good. CVs were 2.9 and 3.2. This is the load for those cows where it varied from one pen to the next, CV of 4 and 10.1. And then this is after we changed that loading order, so haylage went in earlier and leveled out that mixer wagon. So 1.1 and a 2.1. Now this is a low investment for the dairy, right? Changing mixing order, that's really low investment. The hitch modification took their shop guys some time, but not much. And now we got this really good, consistent TMR for our cows. So often these changes we make aren't big money changes. It's just some maintenance things or other, mix time, making it level, low investment items that can really enhance that consistency. Okay, loading position in the mixer box. Really simple one. And Pat's actually gives you an arrow to shoot for. Aim for this area. Go for that one. And here's this guy, he's loading over one auger. And this is a twin screw auger. Well, it still might work. I mean, the mixer wagons, they're designed to move feed between these augers, but there's no sense in challenging the system. Always we want to try to load so that we're, as much as possible, distributing that feed already across that mixer wagon. So here's that feeder delivering that feed properly lined up in the center of that mixer wagon. So again, just help the equipment to do its job as it's designed to do. Hay straw quality and processing. Well, if you're counting on your mixer wagon to process long forages, then of course it's critical that those knives are maintained properly. And when knives start to get dull, they don't do their job. No surprise there. And that's going to lead to that longer forage, which won't be mixed properly and that cows can easily sort out. Most larger dairies, though, they're not counting on the mixer wagon to process the forage. That can be an expensive way to do it. It's more wear on your equipment. It takes more time to do it. It takes more fuel to do it. So often there's other systems that are used to process forage. This is an example of a hay buster being used. It's a hammer mill essentially that does a really good job, especially with straw. With a softer forage like a soft grass hay, that's always hard to process, but with a more brittle forage like straw, it does a good job of it. This is a roto grind, also does a good job of it. I just wanted to show a hay buster. It doesn't have to be a big, on a big flatbed truck with a like excavator loading it. So this here's another hay buster again. This is grass hay, does an excellent job of processing. So now we don't need the mixer wagon to process that long forage. The mixer wagon is only mixing that forage, and that's an advantage. So that's usually what we like to see there. One little thumb rule: how long should that forage be? One thumb rule is about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 on the top screen, middle screen, and pan, the Penn State particle separator. And that top third on the top screen, that should be, absolute length would be 2 inches or 5 centimeters. Ideally, it's probably 2.5 to 5 centimeters, 1 to 2 inches, where we'd want that to be lengthwise in terms of maximal length on that top screen. Okay, loading sequence. Well, that's kind of a one that it depends. Depends on the mixer wagon type, the ingredient type. Within ingredients, its density, particle size, and dry matter, the inclusion level of that ingredient, and convenience. Where the heck is it located on the farm, and where does it fit into my whole loading sequence? So convenience sometimes plays a factor as well. It depends on equipment maintenance. The better shape your equipment is in, the more you can get away with. If it's more worn equipment, boy, ingredient order becomes more important. And mixing time. Basically, you can cover some things up with a longer mixing time. And vice versa. Great equipment, you might not need as much mixing time to really get things mixed properly. So mix order is something where it depends, but in general, our lower density large feed particles are loaded first. So if we have straw, hay, haylage, that's a type of feed to generally go first. Then our drier, more dense feeds are coming after that. So our grains being added, followed by other, let's say, wetter feeds like corn silages, wet brewers, wet gluten feed, and finally liquids, if it's molasses or whey or water, generally going in last. So for example, again, hay or haylage going in first. One exception would be with a real mixer. Grain usually goes in first there. If you put in a big wad of hay, like a big section of hay bale, it could potentially jam up underneath the reel. So that's why usually grain goes in first. Followed by dry grains, any hand adds that might have to be added, they're going to go in as early as possible. Ideally, you only want to add a hand add when it makes up no more than 2% of the feed in that mixer. Okay, so I've got another example of that coming up, but no more than 2% of the total feed in that mixer. That's where you want to try to be putting any hand add in. So early on. Again, followed by our wetter feeds like corn silage, and then any wet byproduct feeds or liquids. I want to share this video, real live example here of a problem. And this was a situation where the nutritionist wanted to add some extra energy to the diet, and he put in some additional dry fat. And on paper, boy, it looked like that really helped, that additional, let's say, quarter pound of dry fat or whatever it was. And it was added, it was put in last, it was put on top of this great big load of feed. And even if this mixes for 5 minutes, 6 minutes, that's not going to get incorporated properly. That's why with lower inclusion ingredients, if it's a really low inclusion ingredient, of course, it should go into a mix. And that mix would either be delivered directly to the farm, or it's a premix that's being made by the dairy. If a hand add is going into the mixer wagon, a good thumb rule is to include that hand add so that it makes up at least 2% of the load size. So this add hand adds early so that they make up more than 2% of the load size when they are added. And that then helps to ensure that they get properly mixed into the mixer wagon. Liquid distribution. We want to get it across that feed as much as possible. Here's an example of a consistent problem on a dairy. And these are 4 loads of feed. And this is the weight of, let's take the look at the bottom ingredients. So front, middle, and end of the mixer wagon, we have about 15% on the bottom, and then about 26%, and then about 34%. And we see in the middle, it's the inverse. So the next load of feed, there's the same thing happening again. The third load of feed, basically the same thing. And the fourth load of feed. So a consistent inconsistency. And what was going on here, the whey was added on one end of the mixer wagon. The mixer truck wasn't level. It only mixed for 1 minute or less after the liquid was loaded. And again, they had a situation where the TMR was extremely wet at the front end of the load, and then it when it was dropped and dry at the other end. So here it is, what we're talking about here. Here's this whey being added to one part of the mixer wagon. Now you're counting on that mixer wagon to be mixing everything throughout here. And just looking at this TMR looks different from one end to the other. I see a lot more lighter colored, lighter appearing particles here versus up here. There's not good movement of feed throughout the mixer. We see kind of a churning action, but not good aggressive mixing action. And we're challenging the system, boy. We're dumping it, all this liquid in one spot. So unlevel as well. Several things that we're not happy with this setup. Well, here's an improvement. This dairy has, excuse me, there we go. This dairy has this liquid being added, and it's over a greater part of the mixer wagon. They've got probably maybe 40%, so that's better. It'd be even better if we could get it distributed over even more of that TMR. And this dairy has done that. This is whey being added to this load of feed, and this whey bar is distributing it over essentially all of that, or at least 80% of that TMR. And this is a really interesting one. This is a dairy that, again, innovative dairy producer, engineer type dairy producer, made this system. It was like a liquid manure spreader where the water comes up, hits this plate, and comes raining down on top of this real auger mixer wagon. So it's a Vermont dairy, innovative Vermont dairy producer coming up with a way to add liquid so it's well distributed across the TMR. Vertical mixer auger speed, something that we learned about how important that is from a problem that happened on a dairy. And what you want to do, you want to count the revolutions per minute of your vertical augers at the mixing speed for a full load of feed. And sometimes that's a challenge because some mixers have essentially an automatic transmission that the auger speed will vary based on the load size. So sometimes it's a challenge to do it, but it's a good thing to try to do there. And let me give you an example why. This was a dairy with a triple screw or triple auger vertical mixer wagon. And one of my colleagues had done a Tmr audit there. And this speed on the augers was a high speed, 42 revolutions per minute for this pecan triple screw vertical mixer. And the CV for the middle screen in the pan, we're off a little bit here, but it's 3.1 and 2.8. Okay, so 3.1 and 2.8. And they had a problem. Yes, big drop in milk production. You can see they're up here in 90 plus pounds of, 93 pounds energy corrected milk, 90 pounds of milk, and they have this big drop in production. And over time, they asked my colleague to come back out, and he did, and asked, anything change? And, no, we got the same forages. We're not sure what happened. Although the mixer wagon, the gearbox did go, and we got a new gearbox, and I'm using it the same way. Well, as it turns out, first gear in the old gearbox had 42 RPMs, and first gear in the new gearbox had 28 revolutions per minute, and our CVs had gone up substantially here. And they increased the speed the second gear, made these CVs really small again, and you can see basically what was tied right in with that was the recovery in production. Well, what was interesting here was looking at butter, fat, and protein. It followed the exact same course where it was higher and consistent and then dropped lower and became inconsistent with this reduction in auger speed. And here you can see it was 1.8 and 1.9. It didn't show up on the last slide. 1.8 and 1.9 up to 4.6 and 5.4, and then back down to 1.6 and 1.8. Again, high and stable, low and unstable, improving and more stable when we had that mix being more consistent. And MUNs followed that same course of basically stability to instability. And that makes sense if you think about a consistent TMR, cows getting the appropriate amount of carbohydrate and protein along the entire length of that bunk, compared to cows getting slugs of carbohydrate or protein. And we've got now variation going on in our rumens and leading to variation in TMRs. And we get that corrected. And again, we see MUN stabilizing. So this was really an eye-opener in terms of the importance of auger speed. And if you think about it, let's just think for a second here. Let's say like a tree leaf, for example, often mixes at about 22 revolutions per minute at its mix speed. And so if you mix for 4 minutes, 22 times 4 is 88 revolutions per minute, or 88 total revolutions for a 4-minute mix time. And if you just focused on, okay, I want 88 revolutions, and you went for 8 minutes, and now it's only 10 revolutions per minute. Well, if you think about that feed, remember that feed mixes when those particles are moving and falling together. Well, if they're moving extremely slowly, and the feed is rising up in the auger very slowly, and then slowly coming down along the edge, it's not aggressively moving and mixing. Okay, so that's why it's important. We get that better mixing action with that more aggressive movement. Well, this is where the colleagues have looked at a bunch of different mixture wagons here, and essentially slow or fast. So we don't have the exact speeds here, but slow or fast. And now what happened with the average CV percent for the middle screen in the pan? And you can see across all these mixture wagons, a big reduction in CVs when that equipment essentially mixed more aggressively, and now those feed particles were mixing properly. So much more consistent TMR when it was mixing properly. Okay, finally, hay restrictor plate settings in vertical mixers. This is an example of these restrictor plates. So typically, there's one on the front of the mixture wagon, and then one essentially kitty corner or the opposite direction on the back of the mixture wagon. And this big piece of metal, when it's pushed all the way in, it's just acting to try to force that TMR into the augers, where the augers will have knives on them, and it will try to cut those longer feed particles. Well, if you think about this big piece of metal into that mixer box, it kind of makes sense that it could impede mixing some. And my colleague Tom was evaluating this TMR here, and notice this great big dead spot. Well, that's where that restrictor plate is pushed out. And now that feed isn't freely moving, it certainly isn't falling. It's moving really good in some spots, right? But we've created a dead spot with that restrictor plate. So this was this Penta 1120 HD. These restrictors are set all the way in, and we're looking at that TMR, and we'll look here at the one on the bottom on the pan here, and we're at 50%, and it goes along, and it goes bloop, 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 all the way up to 60% here. And we see this reduction in the middle screen, and that was consistently happening across these loads of feed. Finally, they took the restrictor plates, looked in the mixer wagon, saw what we just saw, set those restrictor plates halfway in, and if that feed is fully processed, put them all the way in. I mean, make it so they're not doing anything. Let that feed flow freely if you are not trying to use knives in the augers to process that long forage. But look at that difference. And what it did to the CVs, 28, a 6.8, and a 6.7, down to an 8.9, a 1.8, and a 1.7. So super nice, consistent TMR. Okay, another, just watch out. This can happen with worn equipment, and it can happen also with equipment that is not being used properly. A feeder going too quickly, not taking time for it to unload. This is a brand new triple auger Pat's vertical mixer wagon. That's the amount of feed that was left over in that mixer wagon after the feeder delivered a load of feed. It's a few thousand pounds. Now, why was that? It wasn't worn equipment. It's because the feeder didn't take the time for it to fully discharge. And this is important for a number of areas. First, it's dry matter intakes and what was recorded there and what happens with intakes. Did that last group get credit for this feed? Will the next group get this feed weight added to their ration? Then think about the diet itself. If it was the exact same diet, that would be one thing. But what if this was a lactating cow diet and had a lot of alfalfa haylage in it, and the next group is the pre-fresh cows, and we don't want all of those minerals or haylage, for example, that's in the lactating diet to go to the pre-fresh cows, and now they get this much feed. That's not their diet. Or what if the farm made an on-farm grain mix and they didn't completely empty it, and you end up with a 1,000 or 2,000 pounds of feed left in the mixer wagon, and the next day the first load of feed they make up is for the fresh cows, and there's 2,000 pounds of additional grain in there. So we want to make sure that mixer wagon is in good shape, it's being used properly, and it empties properly so we don't have an issue like this. In summary, review the feeding management areas discussed today on your dairy or your client's dairies. And just, there's so many areas that can influence TMR consistency within a load and between a load. Are there any areas on your dairy or your client's dairies that we need to be improving on? And chances are, there definitely are. So what are those areas and what can we do to do a better job? Reduced variation typically leads to improved production and improved cow health, and that's the goal of all of our dairies. So I thank you for your attention. I would be very happy to take any questions or hear any comments that you have at this time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bill, for a great webinar. I think it was a super discussion of good management practices, not only from a feeding standpoint, but also brought in some safety. We will get to the questions in a minute. First, let me introduce the next month's speaker and thank my co-hosts and webinar sponsors. Next month, we will be joined by Dr. Jude Capper, an independent livestock sustainability consultant based in the United Kingdom. She is passionate about sustainability issues and the role of animal agriculture in helping to feed a hungry world using fewer resources. Her current research and outreach work focuses on modeling the environmental and economic impact of livestock production systems. In her professional goal to communicate the importance of livestock industry sustainability, she is on Twitter as @Bovadiva. This webinar is meant to be a companion to the emissions webinar given by Frank Mittler in April. We planned out the Nutritionist schedule in late fall 2019. We felt we were being very topical, focusing on environmental issues. It is safe to say the world focus has drifted to other areas. Nevertheless, if we go out again, focusing on sustainable practices will be a great benefit. Join us for the presentation, followed by a live question and answer sessions on June 11th. The presentation will start at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time and 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Before we thank our co-hosts and sponsors, I want to tell you of a short webinar series we are doing partnering with the Canola Council of Canada. We will be completing our 3-part webinar series highlighting new research findings and practical application of these findings in dairy feed formulation. We held our first webinar in this series on March 31st, an interview with Daniel Scawthorne, and our second, April 28th, with Dr. Anthony Faciola. These both can be found on our website under the webinars dropdown, Canola Council of Canada tab. The final webinar in this series will be with Dr. Kenneth of the Dairy Forage Research Center on June 2nd at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. For more information and how to sign up, you can go to the AMTS Coming Events page. As you know, these webinars take a lot of work and cooperation. They are organized and produced by AMTS USA and Global. Our longtime collaborator is Paula Torillo of Afina, who hosts a series as El Webinar del Nutritionista. She receives support from Guillermo Lerman, Tecnal, Rock River Lab in Argentina, Biotur, and Concar. She has the excellent translation skills of Paula Alanes backing her up. We also thank AMTS distributors. In Italy, Elena Bonfante of Dairy Innovations Italia. In China, Sean Lee of AnsciTech. In Brazil, Marcelo Hens Ramos, director of 3R Lab. And in Russia, Vadim Bekchevnikov of Novolab. Our webinars are made better by the wonderful Questions submitted by Marcos Neves Pereira of Universidade Federal de Lavras in Brazil. We are especially thankful to generous sponsors who make it possible for us to get great speakers and manage the program. We thank our gold sponsors, Arm & Hammer Animal Health, makers of cattle feed ingredients that optimize dairy cow health, and the Canola Council of Canada. Learn more about feeding canola at canolamazing.com. Our silver sponsors are Ajinomoto Heartland, superior nutrition through amino acids, makers of AgiPro L, Dairyland Laboratories, and Virtus, maker of Strata with EPA, DHA, omega-3s, and Prequel with omega-6s. Our bronze sponsors are Dairy One, Forage Laboratory, Amino Max, Adiseo, Purdue Agribusiness, PMI, and Soychlor. Each of these companies support education and research worldwide. We hope that you will consider them in your formulation decisions. I will now open the floor for questions. English language listeners, I will read your question. Remember to type your question in the Q&A tab or the chat window. Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. Bill Stone has joined us. He is in as a caller, so I've unmuted him. Bill, can you just test that and make sure we can hear you?
I can hear you fine, Marianne.
Excellent. I can hear you.
Okay,
We
good.
are very fortunate to have Marcelo Ramos, Elena Bonfante, and Sean Lee joining us for questions. I have some questions in my question window and in my chat window. I have promised Marcelo that we will let him go first because I know that he has some other meetings to get to. Marcelo, if you want to lead off, while you are doing that, will switch to our presentation. Bill, you'll tell me if I need to go to a specific slide to help explain any questions. Anybody that's with us, please make sure that if you have a question that you send it to me in the question window or the chat window, and then we'll get going. And also earlier, Vadim Bekchevnikov from Russia joined us, but he had to leave earlier. So thank you, everybody who has joined us, and let's go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much, Mary, MTS, and everybody. Thank Dr. Bill. Was an excellent presentation. But I had help before with someone from Diamond V. I think it was John. He's also working in addition on dairies, and that you guys do an excellent job. And I think it's the only company doing that. We need to do it more. First question here is slide number 10. I think you touched on a very important point in the variation of the feed. It's very hard to minimize that. And you suggest we mix, slide number 10, we mix the forage at the floor, whatever, before we load it. Would that be also recommended to add the forage at the wagon and mix it there? Would that do the same thing?
Yes, and we have dairies that do that. That's especially helpful if we might be trying to move the forage to the loading area so we can more efficiently make a load of feed. And that can be an easy way to do that. Let's say you've got a corn silage bunker that's a few hundred meters away and from where you're loading that feed, and you don't want to be driving back and forth and back and forth. What can be done is we go through the steps that I outlined there in terms of defacing, pushing it into a pile, even doing some premixing there. You wouldn't want to, for example, think of that big bunker I showed, take one load of forage from one end of the bunker, put that into the mixer wagon, drive it over and discharge it, because that is still not fully mixed, right? So we still want to push it into a central pile, do some quick mixing with a loader bucket. Now put that into the mixer wagon. We can mix it for, that would be a brief time period, let's say at the most 2 minutes, and discharge that at our loading area and have that fully premixed forage and also have it right where we're going to be loading to save time and minimize shrink loss from driving around with the loader bucket.
Excellent, thank you.
You bet.
Marcelo, if you have more questions, you can continue.
Okay.
Elena and Sean, let me know if you have any time constraints.
Okay, I have. Slide number 19, you talk about measure the temperature. And I remember, I think it was John, his name, we worked together. He helped me in Brazil, where he has a long thermometer where we stick, I would say 30, 45 centimeter inside the silage. And that would be the best temperature that we get. Is that still correct?
Yeah, so that thermometer I'm showing there, that is, I'm trying to think of the company that made that. And I can't think of it right now, but it's a really great thermometer, really rugged. Oh, look at the slide there, it's real temp. Okay, so it's real temp that makes it. Anyway, really good, rugged. It's probably not quite a meter. I bet it's 2.5 feet long now. So you can get down deep into that pile. And in terms of how far you go, it's really what question are you trying to answer? It may be at 3 feet down, there's less heating than at 2 feet, but often I'll still see large temperature spikes as I'm showing here. This is pushed down far into the pile. But to me, the big thing is having a good rugged piece of equipment that's also really accurate. This one is. So I'd recommend this large, well-built compost thermometer.
Okay. Keep going, Mary. Mary, did I lose you?
Marcelo, yeah, I'll, by the way, I'll send out the link for the website when I send out the link for the recording for everybody.
Okay, I have more questions. Do you want me to keep going or you
Yes,
want to
keep going. Keep going.
Okay. Slide number 35, and very good presentation again. Thanks so much, Dr. Bill. We really focus on trying to minimize or actually have the goals for the CVs on the middle and the bottom. But yes, we have a great problem with the top ones for a variety of reasons. And you said, just a small amount and that's going to increase the CV. But even having a greater CV, shouldn't we also have a goal like 10% CV or whatever is the number that you get more of the good dairies?
Right. So the question is, we've laid out these precise goals for the middle screen in the pan. What the heck about the top? No, we didn't provide a goal there. And again, as I mentioned, the real reason is you see this dairy here only at 5.5 to 6% on that top screen. We have some dairies that are even less, 3% on the top screen. And then others where it might be 18% on the top screen. And that's where it gets to be difficult, because now we can have such a small amount of variation that would really make for an elevated CV. Personal little goal I have is typically dairies that are really doing a great job, it can be less than 10%. Okay, so you can maybe put that in the back of your mind. Try to have it 10% for the top screen, but just remember that will really be influenced by the amount of feed that's present there. So just take that one with just some caution.
Excellent. Slide number 38. I think when you see there, we have coefficient of variation greater than 4%. And then you say anecdotal evidence has shown a 2 to 5% should be decreased in production, not?
Well, what we're saying there is that if we take a TMR that had CVs greater than 4% on the middle screen in the pan, and then we implement some procedures that bring that down to a 2%, what we typically see is an improvement in production, an increase in production after those changes have taken place, and we now have a more consistent TMR. Okay, so if you looked at it, the inverse is beforehand, you're probably losing some milk, right? You're losing that 2 to 5 pounds of milk by having that inconsistent TMR. We get that correct TMR being delivered, and we want to see that enhancement in production and components and cow health.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Slide number, go ahead.
No, that's fine. I'm glad that's clear now.
Okay, slide number 95. Really good information about the slow and fast auger speed. So as a goal, as a target, we should target for the fast, right? Because we compare slow and fast, so we should mirror and having the fast auger speed as our goal, correct?
Yeah, so a higher auger speed, just think about those feed particles moving more aggressively. There's a much greater opportunity for mixing to occur. But there's big ranges in what those speeds are across mixer wagons. Okay, and there's big ranges, but even I mentioned in the presentation the Treely at 22 revolutions per minute. That might be half of the example we saw there, that pecan at 38 to 40. So you can't get a Treely to do a great big load of feed at 40 revolutions per minute, and it's not necessary. It's designed to properly mix at that lower speed. However, if you took that Treely down to an 11 RPM and then said, well, I'll run it for twice as long, it won't be as good of a mix. Okay, so the point is, within a mixer wagon, there'll be some variation in terms of that auger speed across mixer wagons. But then within that specific mixer wagon, you want to make sure it's mixing at the appropriate and higher speed for that full load of feed.
Okay, got it. Thank you. And the last one, it wasn't clear to me because most dairies would ask that. The recommendation for the order of the ingredients of the vertical and the horizontal one. And I don't have a slide here, Mary, sorry. So
Okay.
usually we get the forage first. Most everybody do that, and the other ingredients. But you said there is a difference order if it is in a vertical or a horizontal one. So can you explain a little bit better this one, please?
Sure. And I'm just trying to find that slide myself here. What I believe I said there actually was with a real augie. That's where I made the slight little correction there. That generally we're going first with those real lightweight particles, so straw, hay, for example. The one little watch out is with a real auger. Let's think about a great big square bale, and you got big slabs of hay. And let's say it's not a real loose alfalfa. It's either a longer alfalfa or it's a grass, and it's pretty tightly packed together. Now you drop that great big section of hay goes in there, and it gets potentially jammed underneath that reel. So that was the reason I said with that type of a mixer, it's often good to put some grain in first. We have some other ingredient there. We have other stuff that helps to minimize that chance of the slab of feed potentially causing a jamming issue. That was the reason for that. The biggest watch out is with density, having lower dense feeds put on top of a load of feed, especially with a vertical mixer, and we're not having the weight now to push that down. And it takes much longer for it to be up it's on top of that mix. It's not being incorporated throughout that mix. So that density part is something you have to be careful with.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, Marcelo, thank you for joining us. Now, Elena and Sean Lee, do you have some questions that you would like to ask? I do have questions in my windows, and I will ask them, but let's give Elena, would you like to go? Sean?
Yes, thank you,
Doesn't?
Marianne.
Okay.
Okay, there you go. Thank you, Bill, for your presentation. It was very interesting. And I was interested in the hay booster and your experience about the use of the hay booster instead of chopping the hay in the Tmr mixer. In particular, do you have numbers about the economic advantages in using that instead of only Tmr mixer, for example?
Yeah, Bill, before you start answering that question, I have a couple of questions that are similar, so I'll pile them in One person is asking the advantages of investing in a hay buster to control the variation in the TMR diets in alfalfa hay, even if the wagon is good. And do you have any idea on the return of investment on using a hay buster or a roto grind compared to a mixer wagon to process hay or straw? So if it helps to bundle all those in, and also concerned about the wear and tear on the mixer and improvements to animal performance.
Right. Okay, well, unfortunately, do we have concrete numbers on that one? That's no. So the answer there is no, in terms of concrete numbers. I'll tell you things that we've seen. Well, first, it could be, it could be something that could be calculated in terms of the equipment cost, obviously. We're looking at the additional time that that mixer is running, and there can be a dollar figure put onto that. You think about diesel engines running at full speed for extended periods of time. It's first that fuel cost, but with the mixing equipment, it's tremendously increases the wear on the equipment. And that's where I don't have an exact number I can give you of examples of dairies that had good baselines of how long a mixer lasted when they processed their forage and how that changed when they went with equipment to process it. I do know, though, that it's real. It reduces mixer life. It really increases expenses. And we had some, I remember one example of a dairy out in western US that a really large dairy where the mixer wagons are used for like 15 plus hours per day. And from 1 month to the next, there was, our team had done a Tmr audits on the dairy on 1 month and looked at the same dairy the next month, evaluated these same mixer wagons. Big wear in 1 month. That's an example, though, of a large amount of alfalfa hay being used in a large dairy where a mixer wagon is running for many hours per day. So, unfortunately, I can't give you an exact number, but again, I guess the other proof of it is, as we look at more and more of our larger dairies, it's the way that they've gone. And I think they've gone that way because they've realized the benefits that are there. The other aspect on the economics, of course, is if you do a TMR audit with your current system, let's say with the knives in there, if it's super consistent, you're not going to get the advantage in terms of reducing CVs and potential health or production advantages. If you do this audit, though, and you find out, boy, I have more variation than what I should have, it's not doing the job that it should be accomplishing, you could use some of our estimates that we provided here, go on the low end, for example, of production, and if you have a CV now at 8 and we can get her down to 2, that should be worth some real money there in production, and I would think in cow health as well. So a long answer, but hard one to give an exact specific number to.
Good. Elena, do you have additional questions or shall I ask some?
Just the last one
Okay.
related to the hay booster again. So, we are in the area of Parmigiano Reggiano and where they feed only dry hays. And I was thinking about the alfalfa hay in specific. Do you think the use of hay booster will be helpful for that, or would it be detrimental because of leaves losses?
Right, that's a real, it's a concern. I think it comes down to what that alfalfa is like. If it's super good quality alfalfa that just breaks apart really easily, it may also have been processed by that baler, so it's already shorter stuff already. I have some concerns in that situation of running it through a hay buster and watching that cloud of leaves that are blowing away as well, and that's the most valuable part of that alfalfa. So I think it comes down to really what that hay is like. If it's again, super good stuff. It's going to break apart in the mixer wagon properly. We're probably okay. If it's not, and boy, that mixer wagon is really having to work to get it to process properly, then it's going to be more important to look at it. The other advantage, of course, you get by processing it, again, if it can be done in a manner to minimize that loss of valuable components of the feed. But the other advantage, of course, is there's variation across bales. And when we can have all those bales processed and put together, we're eliminating that variation as well. So those are the two real considerations. Okay, and I think there really is some. It depends somewhat on how that hay breaks up and what its quality is like there.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Okay,
You're
thank
welcome.
you,
Thank you.
Anna, for your questions. I will start in on some of the ones that I have. So one of the first ones we got was we often have the restrictor plates right in to try and get more aggressive chop and high straw pre-fresh rations. Is this a mistake?
No, not if you're counting on your mixer wagon to process your straw. So if your straw is going in there long, then those restrictor plates are going to need to be set in so that it processes the straw properly. But what you need to do is, for sure, for the other loads of feed, you should take those restrictors out so that they can mix properly. And hopefully, I guess I would again recommend that you test your current system. So deliver that pre-fresh feed, do an analysis of it as I showed here, find out how consistent it is, look to see if there's any issues there. If there's not, then you're set. If you go through and you find out, boy, my CVs are much too large, but I did get the particle size where I wanted it to be, what you could possibly do for that group is let it process with the restrictor plates in, stop it, take the restrictor plates out, let it mix for a few more minutes, and then you get the straw processed to the length that you want, and you get an appropriate mix. So that's how I would probably really check it properly.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question from Francisco in Chile. He's a UW alumni from Dairy Science, and he wants to know the best recommendations to take very representative TMR samples to measure the TMR consistency on a dairy farm. How many TMR samples do you recommend? Obviously 2 are better than 1, but do you think 3 samples is better to do the CV measurements? Both economically speaking, do you have a protocol you can share in order to compare what we're doing here? Thanks a lot and have a great day.
Okay. Well, first of all, always good to hear from a fellow alumni of the University of Wisconsin. Excellent. Now, for your question, obviously what we did here was taking 10 samples, particle sizing them on the farm. And the big reason we do that is we get the answer that day, and we can discuss with management on the dairy that day how we can make these changes to try to make things more appropriate. So to me, it depends on what your question is. And if you're looking for consistency across that whole mix, then the procedure we laid out here, I think that works fine. If you want to look at, it's just, boy, let's see, the herd's not performing as well as what you think it should be, and you want to evaluate, just want to grab a sample of the TMR and see what that is like. I would encourage you, as I think about it here, to look at, actually probably both things. Both what we did here, what it tells you, again, how consistent is it across that whole length of the bunk? You want to know that. Okay, so that would be step one. The other step, just to look at, is it, how close is it to what I have formulated? If you go along the whole bunk, grabbing subsamples, mixing that, sending that sample in, again, it gives you an idea of what's that whole load was like, but it doesn't tell you how much variation there is across the bunk. So he really can, unless you can give me your question better, more exactly what you're
So he's looking
what you're
towards
looking at.
nutrient composition, crude protein and starch, things like that.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah, well, just a few watch outs with the TMR. You got to be really careful. If you take a larger sample, let's say you go along the bunk and you sample it, and now you go to another area to mix that up. Of course, you mix it up, and all the fines are going to the bottom, and the large forage particles are on top. You've got to be really careful how you do that subsampling. You have to have a flat shovel, essentially, scoop shovel. You're scooping up, dumping everything from top to bottom. You want to do that 4-quadrant breakdown with the sample, sampling from each of those. I would sample from each quadrant, some actually. And then you do it all the way top to bottom. You're doing it with your scoop shovel, so you're not leaving any fines behind. So that part is really, really critical. And recognizing that there's more variation in some of those analyses, starch, for example, I would try to get a few samples from each TMR. That would be the best way. The final thing is when you send it to the lab with a TMR, it's always best to say, please grind entire sample, and I'll be willing to pay the extra money to have that entire sample ground, because we have that same concern at the lab with them trying to subsample it. It's just difficult to subsample a TMR.
Right. Would you recommend average if you did multiple samples, averaging them when they came back? When you input them?
I guess as I think about that, if you, let's say it's this really inconsistent TMR from one end of the bunk to the other, right? And so you have a starch that's 22% on one end of the bunk and 32 on the other. So on average, they're at 27, and that's about where I was at for my ration program. What the point would be there is I really need to investigate why I have this much variation across the length of my bunk. Okay, that would be step number one. And once that's taken care of, step number two really would be, okay, now is this ration where I expected it to be based on my formulated ration? If not, why not? Is it an ingredient analysis problem? Is it a loading problem or dry matter problem? So I have more of one ingredient going in than what I expected. Why is that? Okay, so I would go about it that way. And then if you're trying to model out what that group is doing compared to, based on your ration, then once you have those things taken out, then it's time to take that next step and model it out exactly.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think your point of having the entire sample ground is excellent. And the person who asked the question thanked you for that. We sometimes don't know what the labs do, and that's a very good point to say. You may need to have some specifics, and then they'll do what they can do.
Right.
Next question. Does adding molasses have special challenges, especially in cold weather?
Well, if it's straight blackstrap molasses and I'll use 44 below because it's the same Celsius and in Fahrenheit, I think. That could certainly be a problem.
It's pretty cold.
Right? So super, super cold. And of course, the problem lessens as it warms up. With a lot of molasses products, they have other components that are in there that really help with flowability. And if it's a challenge in your environment at these temperature extremes, then you just need to look at a few different options. If can you heat that tank? Can you have a slightly different mix that's used for this really cold weather? It's usually hard to get enough molasses on a grain mix coming to the farm. It just is, it's too wet, and that's why those sugar addition tanks would be on farm. But those would be the things that I would look at.
Okay, thanks so much. Let's see, coming to a couple more in my chat window, and then I have a bunch of questions that were sent to me by one of our cooperators down in Brazil. I'll ask some of them, but I might save some for tonight. So I know it's hard to make these generalizations. A higher auger speed is better, but what happens to the effective fiber in that situation?
Right. And the answer, there's a few things there. First of all, if there aren't knives in that mixture wagon, I mean, no problem. There's typically no effect on that particle size, or very, very minimal. So it's usually not an issue. The bigger issue is the equipment sized properly? Is that tractor or truck powerful enough to mix this at this higher in a correct speed? And so I'm not saying to mix it at a speed that's inappropriate for that mixer wagon, something that wasn't designed to do. It's just making sure that it's mixing at the speed, the higher speed that it's designed to be at, in proper speed. Okay, so again, with particle size, with knives in there, yeah, that can be an issue, but you need to figure that one out. You can't have a mix that's not mixing properly because I'm concerned about reducing particle size. So that can be worked out for sure.
Very good. Thanks. And then what's the best time to do after the last feed is added? Again, I know it's a generalization, but what is sort of the minimal time recommendation to continue mixing?
Sure. 3 minutes is typically minimal, or the minimal amount, and 5 is usually the outside amount. Well, lots of mixers can do 4 minutes, and that does it. And the person's right, it does depend somewhat. The better shape that mixer wagon is in, probably the less time that's needed. Just one interesting thing that we've seen, you can go too long with mixing. We've seen situations where, let's say you mix for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, and that mix is just good. And you thought, you know what, let's try 6 minutes. Let's see what we get. And with some vertical mixers, what you actually get is an increase in your CV numbers. It actually starts to get to be a separation of particles. And there's probably multiple factors that come into that. For example, what's the dry matter of that mix? Probably the drier it is, the easier it is for these particles to start to actually separate in that mixer. Probably the particle size distribution, how much in the middle screen is there, that really helps to hold everything together more. But it's just an interesting observation. More mix time beyond the optimum amount does not make things better. It sometimes makes it worse. So that's just a little watch out.
Thank you. Yes, it's fascinating. As I referenced, I'll have some questions coming up from one of our colleagues in Brazil. The last couple of questions we fielded were from Egypt. I super enjoy that these webinars give an opportunity to people outside of the United States who may not be able to see you, Bill, at all of the seminars that you're not attending lately. So that's terrific. I'm going to ask a couple of the questions from Brazil now. Could you comment on the use of liquid whey in TMR? The proportion usually used in the diet, the nutritional constraints depending on the source, and the effect on the TMR aerobic stability and feeding frequency, especially in hot weather. This question's from Brazil.
Okay. Well, first of all, we have, in our area, we had quite a bit of opportunity to use liquid whey because the first Chobani plant that was made was in East Edmonston, New York. And then they decided to make this other plant out in Idaho. But our producers in central New York had a lot of whey on their hands. And how much can you feed? Well, when the incentive was, they actually paid 5 cents per gallon. to take this way, there was an incentive to put as much in there as I possibly could. And how wet can I make this TMR now? And in my experience with a silage-based ration, adding whey to it, it's usually, we drop lower than about, for sure, 40% dry matter, and 42 would be more my comfort level. We can put that amount of whey into the ration. It seems like it still works really well. Where I think the challenge really comes, let's say you're down to 40% dry matter, and yep, we're working okay, and then we get this big rain event, and all of our forages are much wetter than they would have been, than they typically are. Now our 40% ration is a 5% ration, and it's a soupy mess. So I think that's one reason why in our area, that's our cutoff point. It may be in other areas, Egypt, for example, where it might not rain as much at times of the year, you could potentially be a little bit lower and not have that adverse effect when things are super wet. So that's maybe the first question. Now, of course, that's going to vary. If it's an alfalfa-based diet, you could potentially get away putting on more of it. In terms of exact amount, what did that come to? It was usually wasn't more than a gallon per cow. That was only about a 5.4% dry matter product. Another question I think you had there was stability.
Yes.
So I'll tell you, it's often, so with a fermented product coming in at that lower pH, it's often not really, I haven't really seen much of an issue with it, very honestly. And I think it's because of that lower pH that it's coming in at, that it's helping in that manner.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you have to think about the rest of the diet. If you have a good stable TMR to begin with a VFA profile that has some acetate and some propionate or 1,2 propanediol in that diet, it's going to help with mold and yeast inhibition already. If it's a fermentation profile, it's really high in lactic acid. Lactic acid is a great acid for preserving that forage, dropping the pH quickly, but it's a poor acid for minimizing growth of molds and yeast in the feed out time period. Okay, so there could be a situation where you have a farm with a much more unstable TMR through the VFA profile of their forages, and it's where you just have to keep that one in mind, and it's where situations or circumstances vary across dairies because of things like that. Was there one last part of that question, Marianne?
I think, let's see, feeding frequency per day, especially in hot weather.
Yeah, so that goes back to what I was just saying there. It's the same answer. If you have an unstable TMR, it's obviously you may have to feed more often, or you're going to have to balance out. If I purchase some type of a TMR stabilizer that has acetic acid and or propionic acid or other antioxidants and components in it, can I take that approach and potentially have this TMR that will be stable long enough? Twice a day feeding, I mean, that's certainly is better than once a day feeding. It's better not only for getting that fresh feed out there, but it changes our meal patterns in our cows. Instead of having one larger slug of TMR consumption after that primary meal has been delivered, we have additional meals there which help with rumen stabilization as well.
Yeah, so just a question for you in this area. Obviously, we've been having some farms dump milk, and so there's been a good deal of interest in, can I add that to the diet instead of, for example, maybe whey or water? Have you been fielding those sort of questions, Bill?
Yeah, we've been definitely talking about that and looking at it as well, and we'll be learning more about it as time goes on, for sure. But just my thoughts I have on feeding milk. What's really different about milk versus we talked about whey. So milk hasn't gone through that fermentation process, right? It's an unstable product. Whey is a more stable product. Certainly, typically, that's the case. Milk isn't. And putting an ingredient like milk in there, I would definitely think you'd be looking at feeding a couple of times per day, that you would be looking more at, do I need to put in a TMR preservative, or last year did I use Lactobacillus buchneri in my silages? So I have this enhanced bunk life because I did that, and that's going to help you now in that situation. Another biggie with milk, obviously, if you're going to be hauling milk from the milking parlor down to the feeding area, you got to think about that equipment you're using to take it down there, and those lines you're pumping, and how you're going to get it dispersed onto that TMR, and all of that is going to have to be cleaned. This isn't like our whey tank that can sit there essentially and never be cleaned, and we don't have a problem with it. This is this very perishable product that we don't want to be causing health problems in our cows or a bunch of rot in our feed bunk and leaving piles of it around. We're getting into a maggot and fly problem as well. It's going to be some definite extra steps in management that have to be done to work with it. But having said all that, when I've looked at what it's worth, this is with a herd that was at about a 4% milk fat and a 3-1 protein. It's worth just under $4 a gallon for feeding value. And if it's a dairy that's having to dump a lot of milk, it's going to be a real incentive to look at how in the heck can I feed this stuff. So those are some thoughts I've been going through with that.
Yeah. Hopefully it's a very short-term issue here.
Right.
What are your thoughts on adding, so this is a question from Egypt, in hot weather, especially adding water, especially in high dry matter density diets?
Okay, so adding water to a really dry diet and it's hot weather. In general, I'm going to say go for it. And in that, usually that really dry diet is a diet that's much more sortable. And so that's our first primary one we're looking at, is trying to reduce sorting. Then I would just evaluate. You always want to evaluate things and see how any intervention is working. There's some research that Dr. Trevor DeFries did, adding water to a TMR, where they increased sorting. And that was true in his research, and it's often not true on the farm. And that's where I just make the point, with any intervention, you always want to be evaluating it and make sure that that was the proper step to take.
We had Trevor with us a little earlier. Looks like he stepped out. He will be doing a talk later in the year. So if I can't remember what he's talking about, but there'll be an opportunity to interact with Trevor later in our Nutritionist webinar. I'm going to ask maybe one more question, Bill, and then let you go, because you're going to be with me again tonight, and we'll tackle some of these, unless I get more questions in the Q&A or the chat window. So this was from Marcos Pereira in Brazil. He's very interested in the system of TMR evaluation with the 3 boxes, the Penn State shaker box. It's a great tool for the evaluation of feeding management. Is there a plausible and easy way to evaluate if the planned diet on the computer agrees with the offered TMR? Do you think nutritional models should base their effective NDF requirements on these same boxes to be consistent with a system of evaluating TMR consistency on the farm? How, Bill, I know you use AMTS, how do you incorporate your shaker box data into the program?
Good question. And there's been multiple attempts to and ways to look at that, and different things that influence it. Just one for examples, what's your UNDF level like? And how quickly does that fiber break down makes a difference in how long it's going to be there providing rumination material. And the way that I do it is the top screen is what's really interesting work out of the Minor Institute, primarily looking at that one. That top screen, those long particles, what they really do is increase eating time. Is the primary thing that they do. And in terms of rumination time, the cow swallows that bolus when it's been generally broken down to the appropriate size, then the swallowing occurs, so that if it's shorter to begin with, she can swallow it more quickly. So eating time is reduced somewhat. Where that comes in, and where it's really interesting, is we think about our farms and different farms and how crowded that bunk might be. And what Dr. Grant, who's involved with some of this research looking at this, but he came out with, I think, a good recommendation where if your bunk space is limited and you've got this longer forage particle there, longer TMR, it takes a greater amount of time for them to eat it. And that most likely is not the best approach for that situation. You probably want it to be shorter, more in that middle screen, get them to eat it, get out of the way, go back to their stall and ruminate. So I keep that one really in mind there as I look at our dairies. If it's a 6-row overcrowded barn versus a 4-row not overcrowded at all, we could get by with a different particle length there. And a different particle length would be more appropriate for sure for that overcrowded 6-row barn, right? We wouldn't want that. I had an example in this presentation, 18% on the top screen. We wouldn't want that. Mm-hmm. Okay. The other ones, just to keep in mind there, some other interesting research at the Minor Institute looking at UNDF, where they fed this forage with a higher UNDF level at different particle sizes. And by feeding it at the shorter particle size, they were able to recover some of the production loss that poorer feed had caused in the cows. And that was essentially by increasing passage rate there. So that's how I would recommend you really try to look at this. You don't look at particle length of the TMR with a set number that is the same for all operations. It really should vary based on what are we trying to do in terms of influencing eating time for those cows. We want to think about sorting. The more of the top screen long particle we have there, the more risk we have for sorting. And finally, thinking about UNDF 240, if there's an elevation there, can I potentially counteract it somewhat if that forage is too long by somewhat shortening it? So that's how I think that should be looked at.
All right. Yeah, thanks a lot, Bill. For anybody who's listening that wants to look at some of the discussions that Bill referenced, we had Rick Grant speak in February 2019. You can listen to his entire presentation, and that was on his newer research on the physically effective NDF and physically effective UNDF. And then early on in our Nutritionist webinar series, I believe it was 2016 or maybe 17, he did he did a talk on his behavioral information. So just look in our archives and you can refer back to some of the stuff that Bill just referenced. Paula, I am going to see if you want to start off with some questions. If you don't, I have questions I can go with.
We have one from here.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Stone. It was a pleasure to listen to your presentation, very practical.
Oh, thank you.
So the question is from Gonzalo. He wants to know if the load sequence that you recommended changes with different type of mixers?
Yes. Okay, I'm just writing it down. Does that load sequence change with different types of mixers? Let's go up a slide here, Marianne. Let's see here.
Is up higher?
Let's,
Which way's up for
yeah,
you?
let's go up. Let's go to number 82. It would be.
Okay. And I'm going to bring it actually in a different view so it's easy for you to suss out. Okay, 82.
And I am not online now. I'm only on my phone, and I'm
Okay.
looking at my screen.
Okay.
Okay, so the question is, does this recommendation that I have right here change with different types of mixers? And we have seen a multitude of things work. For example, with a vertical mixer, I've seen it work well putting grains in first and then liquid and making kind of I'll call it a dough, not so thick that it's like a cookie dough, but it's a mixture of your grains and your liquids, and then going, let's say, with your haylage and followed by your corn silage. And I've seen that work extremely well too. To me, one of the big things to think about is you can't have a low density ingredient go in near the end, because we need something to force that low density ingredient down. Okay, so that's probably one of the real big ones to watch out for. Otherwise, with really good functioning equipment, as I just mentioned, putting grains followed by a liquid, that's not the order that I have here at all. But we've seen it work really well too. And then finally, I had just mentioned in the presentation with a real Augie, one little watch out would be, I recommend here to add, again, that dry ingredient first. So let's say it's dry hay. And let's suppose it's a dairy with big square bales and they're coming out in big slabs and they go to put dry hay in first. And let's say that it's hay that even heated a little bit. So those slabs are really tightly held together. And they dump in one of those slabs and that reel brings it down and it hits the bottom, it's just chunk. It potentially could jam that reel. If there's feed in there already, that's much less likely to happen. And of course, you'd want to try to break that big slab up if you could. Because of that, with a real Augie, if you're putting in especially a dry slab ingredient like sections of hay, it would be good to have some grain in there first. Okay, so I hope it was clear, but in answering that question, that there can be some variation here with different types of mixers. I mentioned convenience here. That's often really, we have to take that into account. If a feeder is going to multiple areas on a dairy to get their feeds, and he's at site A, and there's an ingredient we'd rather put in later, well, it's probably not going to work to drive back and forth on the dairy to make this load of feed. We'll try that convenience route, and we'll see if we can still get a good mix. And if we can, we're going to go that way because we're going to be more efficient at making loads of feed.
Okay, all right, thank you. Paula, if you haven't more questions coming in, I will switch over to some of the questions I have from Marcos.
Perfect.
Okay, and Marcos Neves Piera is with us, but he prefers that I ask the questions. So we'll start off with a couple that I didn't ask this morning. The first one is, and these are a couple about equipment actually, or more precisely equipment that you would use to monitor things. Do you see great potential for use by nutritional consultants of the tools that are based on image analysis for the evaluation of TMR particle size at the feed bunk or at TMR delivery? Recognizing that the Penn State shaker boxes are cheap and easy to run, but it takes time and cannot be done with every batch of feed.
Sure. Well, one little issue that I think I'd have with that approach, though, there's the University of Wisconsin, one of the ag engineers there, whose name I can't think of right now, he developed a corn silage processing score monitoring system with your phone. snap a picture of it. Uses image analysis. The problem is every little corn particle has to be separated. They can't be touching. And then the program can completely map that out and figure out the corn particle size, essentially a corn silage processing score right on your phone, right in the bunk. But you have to take the time to separate all those tiny little pieces of grain so it can make an image. Obviously, if that's the same with a TMR, I use the Penn State particle separator. That will be quicker than trying to go through and separate a given representative sample of that TMR. And I'm not sure how it could do it if all those particles were touching, because it has to draw a map around it to determine that particle size of that particle. Now, maybe it would look, if the angle changed abruptly, it could, in the software, figure that's a different particle, and that could be done. If that small particle is lying on top of the big particle, there's no way that could be done. So anyway, it would be really nice if you could just take your phone and point it at the TMR and get the answer. I don't think we're there yet.
Is that maybe Randy Shaver?
No, it's not.
No. Okay. All right. Another question on technology. Could you comment on the use of on-farm portable NIR analysis for fresh forage, and how precise is that, do you feel?
Okay, so on-farm NIR analysis to look at beyond dry matter, it sounds like. It sounds like you're wanting to look at forage, to look at, is it time NDF-wise to harvest my haylage? Boy, I guess I would be leery of it. I would be just a little leery that is that calibration right for this year's fresh forage, that it's going to be accurate enough for me to gauge my harvest on that. I would just double check. I mean, make sure it's accurate. If it's really accurate, that would be helpful. That'd be really helpful. That we could just be taking fresh samples, not using, for example, a peak stick, looking at alfalfa, its height and its physiologic maturity, and looking at those measures to get an indication of NDF. It would be great if we could just use on-farm NAR to look at it, but obviously it would have to be adequately accurate, and that would be my concern. The peak stick works relatively well for alfalfa for all cuttings. It works for all cuttings. Just one thing that I will do sometimes when we're measuring alfalfa, we'll do a scissor snip of it as well. So we'll take some of that alfalfa, we'll harvest a small amount, obviously, cut it up with the scissors, and just get an NDF reading. That's what we're after there.
Can you comment more on the thresholds that you've suggested for the CVs to be lower than 2.5%, 4% for the 8 millimeter and pan boxes, and how can the type of ingredient affect that?
Okay, let's
Is that early on?
let's find that slide here. It's going to be okay. I've got one here, and it would be slide 35 for you, but we've got another one a little bit farther. Okay, here we go. Slide 34. I'm sorry, slide 38.
38. Okay.
Yes.
Here we go.
Okay, how does that vary with ingredients? It doesn't. Okay, so with the ingredients themselves, it shouldn't matter. I mean, let's say you've got haylage balls that are going in there, or clumped hay that's there, and now when you take your sample to run through the Penn State particle separator, you get some of that clumping, and that has influenced the number. Well, the cow could do that same thing now, right? The cow could decide if she wants to eat that clump or not, and it is truly part of the variation. Thus, I don't believe it matters with ingredients. And with the middle screen and pan, that goal really should be to have those numbers less than that approximately 2.5% CV. Was there more to the question than that?
No, I think you covered it. Yeah.
Oh, okay, let me expand on that just a little bit.
Okay.
I've got here the middle screen and the pan. notice that the top screen isn't in there. And as I mentioned in our presentation there, the main reason for that is the top screen is one that varies tremendously across dairies, from the low single digits, let's say 2 to 3%, up to potentially 20% or the low 20s. And with that huge range, if you're down at 2% and we set a tight CV, it's going to be extremely difficult to reach that. And if you're at 20%, it'll be much easier to reach that. Okay, so that's where it's harder to have a real concrete guideline. However, in general, just keep in the back of your mind, if we can have it less than 10%, we're doing really well. But just remember that it can be influenced more so because often it's a very small component of the TMR.
Okay. All right. Thank you. This next question is a bit long, and if needed, I'll see, Bill, you're not even looking at it, you're just listening. So a concern, and these are questions from Brazil, a concern that you usually have in Brazil is not to reduce particle size of the TMR excessively in order to obtain a consistent TMR mixture. Usually a finer diet will have more consistent mixing. For them, it is a frequent concern in diets based on high inclusion of a finely chopped corn silage and high moisture corn as a major starchy concentrate that potentially ruminal acidosis is a problem. This is the most economical feeding strategy for a lot of the dairy farms in Brazil. For this type of diet to work, some long forage needs to be included in the diet at the minimum amount possible, usually 0.5 to 2 kilograms of dry matter per day, less than 7 to 8% of the diet. The long forage is expensive, difficult to handle, and agronomically inefficient compared to the corn silage. Many farmers buy that second forage. Grass hay, and this is a study, this is the type of hay is Synodon tifton, is a common source of long fiber. Would you, in this case, also use the rule of thumb of 1/3 on each box for hay particle size? Is this recommendation totally based on TMR consistency, or is it also considering cow performance and sorting behavior? Did you catch all that?
I think I got most of it.
Okay.
It's essentially leading up to, with that 1/3 recommendation, go for their long forage feeding. The first question I would have for you, though, is, and I don't know if this, I just throw it out there for them to think about. You mentioned they have short chopped corn silage. And I would say, why do you have to chop your corn silage so short? That corn silage is on the middle screen of the Penn-State particle separator will still really promote rumination. And if you're driving too much of that, if you're chopping it so fine that it's a fairly significant amount of forage is actually getting through into the smallest, make it down to the pan even, I would question that. Typically, I see corn silage chop length close to 3/4, I have to, 3/4 inches. We all know 2.54 centimeters in an inch. Let's say 3/4 inch down to maybe 5/8 of an inch. 1/2 inch, I see very few dairies chopping that short. 3/8 inch, again, very few dairies that are going shorter like that. Maybe some people in an upright silo would go shorter, but I would question why you need to chop your corn silage so short.
So Bill, just to wade in,
sure.
This is a question from Marcos, and maybe while you are working on the answer, he will give us some insight on why the short chopping. I think Marcos is still here.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So then to continue on a little bit, though, would I still recommend that 1/3, and you go up to, you said 2 kilograms, which is about 4.5 pounds. And typically what I'm thinking of with that recommendation is straw going into a low energy pre-fresh group where it might be making up between, let's say, 6 and 8 pounds of the TMR. So it's more than what you are saying there.
Yeah. Bill, so to give you
Yep.
insight, a lot of the people in Brazil are harvesting with a 1 or 2 row harvester. And with this machinery to do the, I'm assuming affecting the grain, it needs to be cut short. The big machine.
Okay, so they don't have processors is the bottom. They don't have corn silage processors, and they're using particle length to try to process the corn to get the kernel well, hopefully mixed and broken up.
For big machines, they look to have less than 25% of the corn below the 8 millimeter screen.
Okay. All right. Well, then I'll answer it that way, but I'll also just say they do make processors for pull type corn choppers too. And that might be another approach, is actually look for a kernel processor for your pull type 1 or 2 row corn chopper. I mean, I think they make them for that small of a chopper. I know they didn't make them for pull type choppers. So that would be something to consider. And then you could go with a longer chop length. What I would look at for your forage then, you do want it longer. One thing I mentioned in our session, our question answer session this morning, that longer particle length of a TMR, the main thing that it contributes to is additional eating time. It takes the cow longer to take that, it takes her more time to take those longer feed particles that she just ingested into her mouth, and now she's going to chew that until it gets it to a acceptable smaller particle size, small enough that she can now swallow it. And when we have longer forage, the main thing that we do is increase the amount of time it takes cows to eat that TMR. Because again, she has to masticate it more before she swallows it. So in thinking about that, if you have a situation where there's plenty of room at the bunk, there's not a time constraint for cows to be spending time there at the bunk, I would try to go as long with that forage as you can, as long as they're not sorting it. And that guideline that I gave, that 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and then the particles that are on the top screen, hopefully all less than 5 centimeters approximately, that's to really minimize sorting. It's these producers you're talking about that are spending big money to buy this forage, the last thing they want to see is at the end of the day, they're throwing it away because the cow sorted it out and didn't consume it. Okay, so that's what I'd really look at. Go probably as long as you can. You can get some increased chewing time during eating. You'll still get the rumination time. You have to make sure they don't sort it out, and that's how I would go with it.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Bill. Paula, are you able to ask questions or, yes, you have a question. Would you like to go? Yes.
I have a question about the mixing speed.
Yep.
Yes, sorry. Which is the recommended mixing speed for a vertical mixer?
Okay, let's go to slide 95, Marianne. Okay, so here we see a bunch of different companies here, and they have different mixing speeds. And I'm not going to try to go over every company what speed that they should be at. It varies with what company it is for that vertical mixer. There's not one set speed that should mix at. Okay, so a twin screw vertical that's a pecan versus a twin screw vertical that's a Treely have different speeds that they should be operated at for to get a proper mix. And what we have here in this comparison is within the same mixer type, if it was operated at a slower versus, let's say, the maximal speed, we saw a real reduction in these CVs at that higher speed. Okay, so it definitely depends on the mixer type and the design of that vertical mixer.
Okay. Thanks, Bill. And Paula usually has a lot of questions, but she's been having audio difficulties with this particular webinar. So I think that has cut down on some of the questions.
But I have
Paula?
one more.
Okay, I was going to say, Paula, if you don't have more, I have one more, but go ahead.
Okay. Bill, have you associated particle size distribution inconsistency with nutrient content inconsistency? I'm trying to think, but I think that sampling and determination of particle size distribution contributes to the error, to the variability of the measurements. So what do you think about that?
Would you mind repeating just the second half of your question there?
Yes. I think sampling and determination of particle size distribution contributes to the error, to the high variability of the particle size number.
Okay. Well, let me try to answer this question the best that I understand it. One way we could look at this question is, does particle size variation, does that tie in tightly with nutrient variation? Okay, we're using particle size as a proxy for TMR consistency of that whole TMR. And is that an accurate assumption, a valid assumption for us to be making? And what I can say, I can give you a few examples of that, and then I'll talk about some concerns with it. One time I was doing a Tmr audit with a triple screw vertical mixer Treely. And it was an interesting situation. They would back this great big mixer wagon into a commodity bay. And outside that commodity shed, there were a whole bunch of bins. And those bins had lines that came in, and like the back bin dropped into the back of the mixer, and the middle bins were more in the middle of the mixer, and the front bin dropped only into the front of the mixer. And essentially, we had canola meal going in the back end of the mixer and cornmeal going in the front end of the mixer. Those two would both be in the pan of the Penn State particle separator. And my concern was, is this vertical mixer going to move that energy component to one end of the mixer and that protein component to the other end of the mixer? And with my Penn State particle separator, it could be completely mixed up and I'd never pick it up. In that situation, I did the Penn State particle separator, and I also took samples of the TMR and sent them in for a crude protein analysis. And they matched up exceptionally well, the two numbers. So the crude protein numbers and my particle size numbers matched up really well. Another example of that was a dairy that they'd make their pre-fresh load of feed, and they went and fed the pre-fresh heifers first, and then they added an anion to that mix, mixed it for a couple more minutes, and went and delivered that. Now, they didn't follow our 2% rule. They would have been under that hand add would have been less than 2%, so that wasn't correct. And I was concerned, is my particle size going to be able to detect this issue with an anion? Well, I took samples of that one too. It looked good particle size wise. Okay, so that was consistent from the heifers and right through to the cows. And the chloride numbers that I analyzed were also consistent. So they were low with the heifers and they went up, and they were consistent for the rest of the way with the cows. Now, is it perfect? No. I mean, I could envision a situation where you had corn silage and haylage with extremely similar particle length and potentially loaded in different parts of the mixer wagon, and then not mixed properly. And here's these two forages that didn't get mixed well, but they're so similar in particle size that we didn't pick it up. That is certainly possible. I don't think it happens very often though. And again, the benefit that we have of using that particle size approach is that we have a rapid answer. If it was a rapid answer and it was no good, let's say some of our COVID-19 tests that are out there. And you get a rapid test, but it only has a 50% sensitivity or specificity. That's no good, right? We have to do better than that. And I think with our Penn State particle separator, we're much better than that. I know it's not 100%, but it's generally pretty darn good.
Okay, thank you. Bill, I have one more question, unless Paula or someone writes a question in the Q&A or the chat window, I'll finish with this one. Oh, although I will make a comment that you made this morning that I think would be well heard this evening too. Some of the difficulties of taking TMR samples, you indicated that you always ask the laboratories to make sure that they grind the entire sample before they run their tests. Can you speak on that?
So,
yeah.
Sure. So you think about a TMR, there's a huge disparity in particle size. And let's say that you went along a bunk and you collected samples all along that length of the bunk, which is what you should do if you're trying to get just a representative sampling of the entire bunk. So you collected samples along the bunk, now you have them in your bucket, and you dump them on some nice clean concrete, and you take a little, let's say a little shovel, and you mix them up, and you're picking it up and dumping it over. Remember, those feed particles mix and they're falling together at the same time, so you're getting everything mixed up really well. And now, ideally, you should do your 4-quadrant breakdown and subsample from the 4 quadrants. But when you're subsampling, you're not grabbing with your hand, right? Just like with a forage, with corn silage in particular, you never want to reach down and grab from the top. You want to scoop so you get everything that went all the way down to the bottom, along with the larger particles on top, and that goes into your sampling bag. What the concern is, no doubt all of the labs work to get good people that are there working at their labs, and those people are doing their best to do a good job. But the issue, they got that same issue. You've got this TMR that's arrived at the lab, and there's a risk there that the subsample that's taken for grinding and analysis could be biased in the way that they sampled it, the way that they took that subsample. And what some labs will have available is the option to have the entire sample ground within reason. You can't send in a 50-pound bag of it, obviously, but have the entire sample ground, and there'll be an additional charge because it takes some extra time, extra work to grind that. But now that potential variation has been removed. That sampling variation has been removed. Everything's going to get mixed together as it's been ground, and they mix that ground sample. And I have seen that approach reduce much variation in on-farm TMR variation, where people thought, boy, this TMR is varying a lot. Well, unfortunately, part of it was the sampling and lab variation that was going on there too. So this can help with that variation.
Okay, thank you for that's an excellent point. The final question that I'm going to ask is, and this is, we're very near to those slides. It's Marcos felt it was very interesting, the data relating to the consistency of low-fat protein and milk secretions. Can you comment more on that? And if you can direct me to, I think I'm close by where you talked about it towards the end.
Sure. I think what he's referring to is, looks like it's about slide 90, for you it would be 93.
Okay.
And let's actually go up one slide before that.
Okay.
And I believe this is what's being referred to, where here's this herd that's making, let's say, about 45 kilos of milk, cruising along nice and steady. Boom, they got a drop. They lose basically 14 pounds of milk or so. And then we went through the discussion why that had happened. If we go to the next slide, what happened with butterfat and protein, we see both of those came down. Butterfat came down more than protein. And I think the most likely reason for that is, just remember with the biohydrogenation theory and the production of these forms of CLA that we don't want leaving the rumen. So for that to happen, we need to have polyunsaturated fatty acids that are in the diet, and they're always there. So that's the first part, PUFA, and they're there. The more that's there, the more at risk we're at in this situation. But the next one is we need a quote from Cornell University, we need an altered ruminal fermentation. And here with this inconsistent mix, we definitely have an altered ruminal fermentation. So now the two necessary components for milk fat depression are in play. We have polyunsaturated fatty acids present. We have an altered ruminal fermentation. We might not have, we're less likely to have complete biohydrogenation of these unsaturated C18 isomers. And now when they exit the rumen, they go and cause the issues with milk fat depression. So that's how I think that's really tied in there. And with protein, likewise, we get the most microbial protein yield, of course, when everything is in line in the rumen, carbohydrate, protein, fiber. When we have a rumen that's fluctuating in terms of pH and in terms of availability of nutrients to the rumen microbes, there won't be as much of a yield of rumen microbes as well, and that can hurt milk protein. Of course, if there's a lesser amount of VFAs coming out of the rumen, there's less energy available to the cow. That's also related to milk protein too. So those are in my mind the main reasons that variation increased for component percentages in this situation.
Very good. Thank you. Unless I get any more questions, or Paula, if you have any more, I think that we can wind everything down. Paula, how are you?
I don't have more questions. I really want to say thanks to Dr. Stone. It was a pleasure to hear you.
Oh. Well, I hope it was a pleasure to everyone and it wasn't too painful, but thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Yes, no, thank you. We had a great response, and I think everybody did enjoy it. Marcos says thank you, and thank you everybody who attended. And Bill, thank you so much. It was great to have you. You know, we're, I don't know, 12, 15 miles apart. Haven't seen you in forever. Right. Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Bill.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye, Paula. Bye, Marcos.